They say life can change in the blink of an eye, and I never understood just how true that was until it happened to me. You know, sometimes it's not the big, dramatic moments that turn your world upside down. It's the quiet, unexpected ones. The ones that sneak up on you when you think you're safe, comfortable, even invisible. This story, it's the kind of thing that makes you question everything about who you are, the choices you've made, and the life you thought you were living. And the thing is, it wasn't just one moment. It was a series of small, seemingly harmless things that build up, piece by piece, until everything just collapsed. It started on an ordinary day, as most extraordinary things do. The house was empty, quiet in a way that felt almost unnatural. My daughter and her boyfriend had left for a trip. My husband was somewhere else entirely, both physically and emotionally, and I was alone. Or at least, I thought I was. The funny thing about loneliness is that it creeps up on you. You don't wake up one day and feel it slam into you like a wave. It's more like a slow drip, a leak in the ceiling you don't notice until the whole roof caves in. And on that day, the roof caved in for me. I was in the shower, letting the hot water wash over me, trying to scrub away the heaviness I'd been carrying. My mind was wandering, as it always does when I'm in there, thinking about the bills I hadn't paid, the dinner I still needed to plan, the way my husband had barely looked at me when he left that morning. And then I heard it. A knock. Light at first, almost hesitant, but it cut through the sound of the water like a knife. I froze. My heart started pounding in my chest, and for a second, I told myself it was nothing. Maybe I'd imagined it. Maybe it was just the house settling. But then, there it was again, this time louder, more deliberate. I called out, my voice shaky, "Hello? Is someone there?" No answer. Just the sound of my own breath echoing in the tiled room. And then a voice. Calm, familiar, but entirely out of place. "Do you need a towel?" That voice, it wasn't my husband's. And it definitely wasn't my daughter's. My stomach dropped. My brain started racing, trying to make sense of what was happening. What was he doing here? He wasn't supposed to be here. They'd left, she'd left, and I was supposed to have the house to myself. I felt my face flush, and not from the steam of the shower. I was suddenly hyper-aware of how vulnerable I was, how exposed. I didn't know what to say. I didn't even know what to think. Seconds felt like hours as I stood there, water streaming down my back, heart hammering in my chest. I wanted to believe it was innocent, a misunderstanding, a mistake. But deep down, something didn't feel right. Something about the way his voice lingered, the way he'd knocked twice, the way I could almost feel his presence on the other side of that door. It set off an alarm in me I couldn't ignore. And then, the sound of footsteps, retreating down the hall. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding, but the relief was short-lived. Because that moment, that one, tiny moment, was the start of something I wasn't ready for. Something I couldn't stop. Looking back, I wish I could say I slammed the door shut on whatever was coming. But the truth is, sometimes life doesn't give you the luxury of clear decisions. Sometimes it pulls you into a story you never wanted to be a part of, and before you know it, you're living in the aftermath of choices you didn't even realize you were making. That was the day it all began. The day my world started unraveling. And as much as I want to hate him for what he did, or hate myself for what happened, I can't. Because the truth is, nothing is ever that simple. Not when it comes to love or loneliness or the messy, complicated ways we try to fill the emptiness inside us. It's strange how a house can feel so full and empty at the same time. Ours used to be alive, brimming with laughter and chaos, the kind that only comes with raising a family. But somewhere along the way, the noise faded. The laughter turned into polite smiles, the chaos into carefully timed routines, and the warmth into something else entirely. Something colder. I've been married to my husband for nearly 20 years. We used to be inseparable, the kind of couple who finished each other's sentences, who shared every secret, every dream. But time has a way of dulling things, doesn't it? It sneaks in, takes what's bright and shiny, and leaves it muted, worn down. These days, he's always busy. Work calls, emails, meetings, things that keep him physically present but emotionally absent. I've gotten used to it, I suppose. You tell yourself it's just a phase, that things will get better, that the spark will come back. But years go by, and you realize you're living with a stranger. And then there's my daughter, the light of my life. She's everything I used to be: bright, confident, full of energy and hope. She doesn't see the cracks in this house yet, and I pray she never will. She met her boyfriend about a year ago, and I'll admit, when I first saw them together, I felt a pang of jealousy. Not because of him, but because of the way they looked at each other, like the world melted away when they were together. His name is James. He's charming, polite, the kind of boy any mother would be happy to see her daughter bring home. But there's something about him, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. Maybe it was the way he always seemed just a little too perfect, a little too eager to please. Or maybe it was the way he looked at me sometimes, just a moment too long, with an intensity that felt unsettling. I brushed it off at first. After all, what reason would he have to look at me like that? I'm not young or vibrant like my daughter. I'm just me. A middle-aged woman who spends her days managing a house that feels more like a museum and a marriage that feels more like a memory. That Saturday, when they left for their trip, I had planned to enjoy the quiet. I thought maybe I'd read a book, take a long bath, or finally tackle the laundry piling up in the corner of the bedroom. But as the hours passed, the silence grew heavier, pressing down on me like a weight I couldn't shake. The house felt different without them. Too still. Too quiet. Even the sunlight streaming through the windows seemed colder, less inviting. I wandered from room to room, trying to find something, anything, to distract myself. But my mind kept drifting back to that knock on the bathroom door, to James's voice, so calm and casual, as if he belonged here, as if nothing about the situation was out of the ordinary. Why was he here? Why hadn't he left with her? My daughter had told me they were going to spend the weekend at a cabin with friends. She'd kissed me on the cheek, said, "Don't worry, Mom. We'll be back before you know it." And yet, here he was, in my house, while she was miles away. I told myself there had to be an explanation, that I was overthinking things. But the unease wouldn't go away. It was like a splinter lodged under my skin, small but impossible to ignore. I thought about calling my daughter, asking her why James was still here. But what would I even say? "Hey, sweetheart, did you forget to take your boyfriend with you?" It sounded ridiculous, even in my head. So, I did nothing. I stayed quiet. And in that quiet, the questions grew louder. Later that evening, I found myself in the kitchen, absent-mindedly chopping vegetables for dinner. The rhythmic sound of the knife against the cutting board was almost soothing, a small escape from the storm brewing inside me. And then I heard footsteps. I turned, and there he was. James, standing in the doorway, hands in his pockets, his face unreadable. For a moment, neither of us said anything. The silence stretched between us, thick and heavy, until he finally spoke. "I didn't mean to scare you earlier," he said, his voice soft, almost apologetic. I thought you might need a towel." I forced a smile, trying to keep my voice steady. "It's fine. I was just surprised, that's all. I thought you were with my daughter." He hesitated, his eyes meeting mine for just a second too long. "She forgot something, so I came back to grab it. I didn't want to bother you." There it was again, that feeling. That little voice in the back of my mind whispering that something wasn't right. But what could I do? What could I say? "Well," I said, turning back to the cutting board, "she's lucky to have someone so thoughtful." I felt his eyes on me, lingering as I continued chopping. My hands were steady, but inside, my heart was racing. The air in the room felt charged, electric, as if something unspoken was hanging there between us, waiting to be acknowledged. And that's when I realized, this wasn't just about him. This was about me, about the person I had become, the person I was afraid to admit I might be. Because deep down, I knew the truth. I was lonely. Desperately, achingly lonely. And loneliness has a way of making you see things that aren't there, or maybe it just makes you notice the things you've been trying to ignore. I don't know what I expected him to do next. Maybe I hoped he'd leave, that the tension would break, and I could go back to pretending everything was normal. But he didn't. He stayed. And in that moment, I felt the ground shift beneath me, as if I was standing on the edge of something I couldn't quite see but knew I couldn't step back from. I could feel it. The atmosphere had shifted, subtle but undeniable. It wasn't just James's presence lingering longer than it should, or the way his words seemed to carry layers I wasn't ready to unravel. It was something in me, too. A creeping awareness that life as I knew it was teetering on an edge. And that edge came sharper into focus with every passing moment. Later that night, I found myself in the living room, curled up on the couch with a cup of tea. The glow of the television filled the room, some forgettable movie playing in the background. I wasn't really watching it. My mind was elsewhere, replaying the events of the day like a broken record. Then I heard it again. Footsteps. Not hurried, not frantic, just steady, deliberate. They stopped just outside the room, and for a moment, the house fell into an eerie silence. I turned my head toward the doorway, and there he was. James. Again. He leaned casually against the frame, his hands tucked into his pockets, his expression unreadable. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked, his voice low, almost a whisper, as though we were sharing some unspoken secret. I forced a smile, the kind you give when you're trying to mask how off balance you feel. "Just needed some quiet time," I replied, holding my mug a little tighter than necessary. "It's been a long day." He nodded, stepping into the room as if he belonged there. He didn't sit down, didn't ask if he could stay, he just lingered. His presence filled the space in a way that made it feel smaller, more intimate. I should have asked him to leave, should have said something to break whatever strange connections seemed to be forming. But I didn't. I couldn't. Instead, he spoke again. "You know, I've always admired how calm you seem, even when things must be complicated." His words hung in the air, and I wasn't sure if he was talking about my marriage, about life, or something else entirely. The way he looked at me, though, made it clear he meant more than he was saying. "Complicated?" I repeated, my voice lighter than I felt. "I think that's just another word for being too tired to care." He chuckled softly, the kind of laugh that feels more like an acknowledgement than amusement. "Maybe," he said. "But I think it's more than that. You're stronger than you realize." The words caught me off guard. When was the last time someone had said something like that to me? When was the last time I felt seen, really seen? And why was it coming from him, my daughter's boyfriend, of all people? It didn't make sense, but in that moment, I didn't care. It felt good. Too good. Before I could respond, he stepped closer, not enough to invade my space, but just enough for the air between us to grow heavier. "I should go," he said, though his body language said otherwise. "I didn't mean to keep you up." And then he turned and walked away, leaving me alone in the glow of the television and the whirlwind of my thoughts. I sat there for what felt like hours, staring at the empty doorway, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Was it harmless? Was it innocent? Or was it something else entirely? The next day, I woke up earlier than usual, my mind still tangled in the events of the night before. I told myself I was imagining things, that I was reading too much into a moment that probably meant nothing. But when I went downstairs and found James in the kitchen, his presence felt anything but accidental. He was standing at the counter, pouring himself a cup of coffee like he belonged there, like this was his home, not mine. He looked up as I entered, a small, almost knowing smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "Morning," he said, his tone casual, but his eyes, those eyes, held something else. "Morning," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady as I moved toward the fridge, pretending to be occupied with finding something to eat. The air between us was thick, charged with an energy I didn't understand, but couldn't ignore. "You're up early," he said, leaning back against the counter. "Couldn't sleep?" I glanced at him, my heart racing for reasons I couldn't, or wouldn't, admit. "Something like that," I muttered, pulling out a carton of eggs and focusing on cracking them into a pan. He didn't say anything for a while, just stood there, watching me. It should have made me uncomfortable, but it didn't. Not exactly. It was unsettling, yes, but there was something else, too, something I didn't want to name. As the eggs sizzled in the pan, he finally broke the silence. You're different than I thought you'd be." The comment caught me off guard. Different how? I asked, turning to face him. He shrugged, a small smile playing on his lips. "I don't know. More real. My girlfriend talks about you a lot, but she doesn't do you justice." My breath caught in my throat. This was crossing a line, wasn't it? But instead of shutting it down, I found myself saying, "Well, I hope she says good things." He smiled again, that same knowing smile that made my stomach twist in ways I didn't want to admit. "Only the best," he said, his voice soft, almost intimate. Too intimate. And just like that, the ground shifted beneath me again. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was there. A boundary had been crossed, and I wasn't sure there was any going back. Looking back now, I wish I'd seen it for what it was, a warning, a sign to pull away before it was too late. But in that moment, all I could see was the way he looked at me, the way his words seemed to reach into the parts of me I'd long forgotten. And for the first time in a long time, I felt alive. I didn't know it yet, but that morning was just the beginning of something I couldn't stop. Something I wasn't ready for. Something that would change everything. The days that followed were complicated. I kept telling myself that everything was fine, that I was imagining things. But the truth was, I didn't believe my own lies. Every time I thought about James, about the way he spoke to me, the way his eyes lingered just a second too long, I felt a pang of something I couldn't quite name. Guilt? Confusion? Maybe both. I tried to push it away, to bury it under the weight of my daily routine. I told myself he was just being friendly, that I was overthinking everything. After all, he was young, confident, and charismatic. That kind of charm can be disarming, can't it? Maybe I'd misread the situation, or maybe I was just seeing what I wanted to see, something to fill the void that had been growing inside me for years. But no matter how much I tried to convince myself, the unease wouldn't go away. It clung to me like a shadow, following me from room to room, whispering in the quiet moments when I was alone. And when I wasn't alone, when James was there, it was worse. So much worse. There was a moment, just a few days later, that I'll never forget. I was in the backyard, pulling weeds from the flower beds. It was one of those mindless tasks that usually helps me clear my head, but not that day. I was too distracted, too lost in my thoughts to notice him until he spoke. "You have a beautiful garden," he said, his voice startling me so much I nearly dropped the trowel. I looked up to find him standing a few feet away, his hands in his pockets, that familiar smile on his face. "Oh," I stammered, brushing the dirt from my hands. "Thanks. It's a lot of work, but it's worth it." He nodded, stepping closer. "It's peaceful out here. I can see why you spend so much time on it." I forced a smile, trying to focus on the flowers instead of the way his presence seemed to shift the air around us. "Yeah, it's my little escape." "You deserve it," he said softly, his eyes locking onto mine. "You deserve a place where you can just breathe." His words hit me harder than they should have, and I felt a lump rising in my throat. How long had it been since someone said something like that to me? How long had it been since anyone even noticed how much I needed a break, a moment to myself? I wanted to say something, to deflect or change the subject, but the words wouldn't come. And then he did something that caught me completely off guard. He reached out, brushing a stray leaf from my shoulder. It was such a small gesture, so innocent on the surface, but it felt anything but. My breath caught, and for a moment, I couldn't move. "I should probably get back inside," I said quickly, stepping back and breaking the moment. My voice sounded shaky, even to me, and I hated how obvious it was. "Of course," he said, his tone easy, as if nothing had happened. I didn't mean to interrupt. But he had interrupted. He'd interrupted something I didn't even realize was happening inside me. As I walked back into the house, my hands trembling, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was standing on the edge of something dangerous. Something I couldn't control. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing with questions I didn't want to answer. Why was he still here? Why was I letting him get to me like this? And, most importantly, what was I going to do about it? I thought about my daughter, about how much she loved him, about how happy he made her. The guilt hit me like a wave, crashing over me and pulling me under. How could I even entertain these thoughts, these feelings? What kind of person did that make me? But then, just as quickly, another thought crept in, quieter, but no less powerful. Was it really my fault? I hadn't done anything. I hadn't asked for this. Maybe I was imagining it. Maybe it was all in my head. After all, people misinterpret things all the time, don't they? Maybe I was just projecting my own loneliness onto him, reading too much into his actions because I wanted to feel noticed, wanted to feel seen. Still, the unease wouldn't go away. It followed me through the next day and the day after that, growing heavier with every passing moment. I found myself avoiding him whenever I could, retreating to my room or finding excuses to leave the house. But even when he wasn't there, the thought of him lingered, a constant reminder of the boundaries I wasn't sure had been crossed, or maybe just blurred. One evening, as I sat alone in the living room, I caught my reflection in the window. I barely recognized the woman staring back at me. She looked tired, worn down, but there was something else in her eyes, something I didn't want to admit. Longing, not just for him, but for something more, something I hadn't felt in years. And that's when I realized, this wasn't just about James. This was about me. About the parts of me I'd been ignoring, the parts that had been screaming for attention, for connection, for anything to remind me I was still alive. And the scariest part? I didn't know how to make it stop. As I sat there, wrapped in the quiet of the house, I felt a tear slip down my cheek. It wasn't sadness, exactly. It was something deeper, something I couldn't quite name. And in that moment, I knew that whatever came next, it wasn't going to be simple. It wasn't going to be easy. But it was coming, whether I was ready for it or not. The days that followed felt like a slow burn, a quiet storm brewing just beneath the surface. Everything on the outside looked normal, the house, the routine, even the way James and I interacted when others were around. But inside, in the spaces where words weren't spoken and glances lingered just a second too long, everything was different. It started with small moments. Subtle things. Things you could brush off if you really wanted to. Like the way he would stand just a little too close when we were in the kitchen. Not close enough to cause alarm, but close enough that I could feel his presence, could sense the tension in the air between us. Or the way his eyes seemed to find me across the room, no matter where we were. He wasn't staring, exactly. It was softer than that, more deliberate. Like he was trying to say something without saying anything at all. At first, I convinced myself it was nothing. I told myself I was being paranoid, that I was reading too much into innocent interactions. But then there were the other moments, the ones I couldn't explain away so easily. One evening, I was setting the table for dinner. My daughter was still out running errands, and James had offered to help. He was handing me the plates, one by one, when his fingers brushed mine. It was such a small thing, the kind of accidental touch that happens a dozen times a day without meaning anything. But this felt different. It lingered, just for a moment, but long enough to send a shiver down my spine. I looked up at him, expecting to see an apology in his eyes, maybe even a bit of embarrassment. But instead, I saw something else. Something that made my stomach flip. His gaze was steady, unflinching, and in that instant, I knew it wasn't an accident. He was testing the waters, seeing how far he could go. I pulled my hand back quickly, mumbling something about needing to check on the food in the oven. My heart was pounding as I walked away, and I couldn't help but wonder, had I imagined it? Was I overreacting? Or was there something unspoken building between us, something I wasn't ready to acknowledge? The next day, it happened again. I was sitting on the couch, flipping through a magazine, when James walked in. He didn't say anything at first, just sat down on the other end of the couch. The space between us felt charged, electric, like we were both aware of something neither of us wanted to name. After a few minutes, he leaned over, holding out his phone. "Have you seen this?" he asked, his tone casual, as though he were showing me a funny meme or a news article. I glanced at the screen, not really processing what was on it. "No, I haven't," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. But then he leaned closer, so close that I could feel the warmth of his breath against my cheek. It was such a small thing, a moment that could have been completely innocent. But it wasn't. Not to me. I shifted away, my heart racing, and pretended to focus on the magazine in my lap. He didn't push, didn't say anything else, but the look on his face as he stood up and walked out of the room told me everything I needed to know. He knew. He knew exactly what he was doing to me. That night, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying every interaction in my mind. The touches, the glances, the way he always seemed to be around when no one else was. Was it really happening, or was I imagining it? And if it was happening, what did it mean? Was he just being flirtatious, testing the boundaries for fun? Or was there something more, something deeper? And then there was the question I didn't want to face. How much of this was my fault? I wasn't encouraging him, not intentionally, at least, but I wasn't exactly shutting it down, either. Part of me hated him for what he was doing, for making me feel things I didn't want to feel. But another part of me didn't hate it at all. I tried to focus on my family, on the life I had built with my husband and daughter. But every time I saw James, every time I heard his voice or caught his eye, that life felt farther away. It was like I was being pulled in two directions, torn between the person I was supposed to be and the person I was afraid I might be becoming. The tipping point came a few days later. I was in the laundry room, folding clothes, when he walked in. He didn't say anything at first, just leaned against the doorframe and watched me. I could feel his eyes on me, and my hands started to tremble as I folded a towel. "You're really good at this," he said finally, his voice low and soft. I laughed nervously, not looking up. "At folding laundry? I guess I've had a lot of practice." "No," he said, and there was something in his tone that made me stop. "At keeping everything together. This house, your family. You make it look effortless." I looked up then, meeting his gaze, and for a moment, the world seemed to stop. There was something in his eyes, something raw, something real, and it terrified me. Because in that moment, I realized I wasn't the only one feeling this. Whatever was happening between us, it wasn't one-sided. I wanted to say something, to break the tension, but the words wouldn't come. And then, before I could think, before I could stop myself, I dropped the towel in my hands and walked out of the room. I didn't look back, didn't see the expression on his face as I left. But as I climbed the stairs to my bedroom, my heart pounding in my chest, I knew I couldn't keep pretending this wasn't real. Something was building between us, something I couldn't ignore. And the scariest part? I wasn't sure I wanted to. It happened on a quiet evening, the kind of evening where the world feels still, as if it's holding its breath. My daughter was out with friends, my husband was working late, again, and the house was mine. I should have felt relieved, free to relax in the solitude. But instead, I felt restless, uneasy, like I was waiting for something to happen. I told myself to shake it off, to stop letting my imagination get the better of me. I decided to take a shower, hoping the hot water would wash away the tension that had been building for days, weeks, maybe even years. The bathroom was warm and steamy, the mirror fogged over as I stepped under the spray. The water cascaded over me, soothing and relentless, but my mind wouldn't quiet. It kept circling back to James. To the way he looked at me, the things he said, the way his presence seemed to fill every empty corner of my life. I hated myself for thinking about him. I hated the way my chest tightened at the memory of his touch, the way my heart raced whenever he was near. And then I heard it. A knock. Soft, hesitant, but unmistakable. My breath caught in my throat, and for a moment I told myself I'd imagined it. But then it came again, louder this time. I froze, the water pounding against my back as my mind raced. Who could it be? My daughter wasn't home, and my husband never knocked. My heart began to hammer in my chest, and I called out, my voice shaky and uncertain. "Hello?" Silence. For a moment, I thought whoever it was had gone, but then I heard the doorknob turn, slow and deliberate. My stomach dropped. The door creaked open just a crack, and I saw him, James, standing there, his silhouette hazy through the steam. "James?" I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "What are you doing?" He didn't answer right away, just stood there, his hand still on the doorknob. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft, almost pleading. I needed to talk to you. Now, I asked, my mind reeling. This isn't. You shouldn't be here. I know, he said, stepping inside and closing the door behind him. But I couldn't wait. I can't stop thinking about you. My heart was pounding so loudly I was sure he could hear it. This is wrong, I said, my voice trembling. You need to leave. I can't, he said, and there was something in his tone that made me shiver. I've tried, but I can't. You're all I think about. The steam swirled around us, thick and suffocating, as he took another step closer. I backed up instinctively, my hand gripping the edge of the shower curtain. James, stop. This isn't right. I know it's not, he said, his eyes locking onto mine. But I can't help how I feel. Can you? I opened my mouth to protest, to tell him he was wrong, that I didn't feel anything for him. But the words wouldn't come. Because the truth, the awful, unbearable truth, was that I did. I felt something. Something I didn't want to admit, even to myself. He took another step closer, his hand brushing against mine where it clutched the curtain. The touch was electric, sending a jolt through my entire body. I wanted to pull away, to scream, to run. But I didn't. I couldn't. Tell me to leave, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. If you don't want this, tell me and I'll go. I opened my mouth again, but the words caught in my throat. I knew what I should say. I knew what the right thing to do was. But in that moment, with his eyes locked onto mine, the heat of the room pressing down on us, I couldn't say it. Instead, I stayed silent. And in that silence, everything changed. He stepped closer, his hand sliding down to mine, and for a moment, the world seemed to stop. I could feel the heat of his skin, the intensity of his gaze, the weight of the decision I wasn't making. And then, before I could think, before I could stop myself, I let go of the curtain. The next moments were a blur, a tangle of emotions and sensations that I couldn't untangle even if I tried. Shock, fear, desire, shame. They all crashed over me like waves, relentless and unstoppable, pulling me under and leaving me gasping for air. When it was over, the reality of what had happened hit me like a freight train. I stood there, still dripping wet, my heart racing and my mind spinning. James was gone, the door closed behind him, but his presence lingered, filling the room like the steam that hadn't yet dissipated. I sank to the floor, my knees trembling as I tried to process what I'd done. What we'd done. My hands shook as I covered my face, tears streaming down my cheeks as the weight of my actions settled over me. I had crossed a line I could never uncross. And the worst part? A part of me didn't regret it. That night, I lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling as the events of the evening played over and over in my mind. I felt sick, disgusted with myself for what I'd done, for what I'd allowed to happen. But beneath the guilt and the shame, there was something else. A spark of something dangerous, something I didn't want to name. Something that terrified me even more than the guilt. And as the first light of dawn crept through the window, I realized the truth. There was no going back. The line had been crossed, the boundary shattered, and nothing would ever be the same again. The next morning felt like waking up in a stranger's house. The sunlight streaming through the curtains didn't feel warm or inviting. It felt harsh, accusatory, as if it was trying to expose everything I was desperate to hide. My mind was a storm of questions, regrets, and fears, all swirling together in a chaos I couldn't escape. James acted as if nothing had happened. He was in the kitchen when I came downstairs, sipping coffee and scrolling through his phone like it was just another day. I froze in the doorway, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure he could hear it. For a moment, he looked up, our eyes meeting briefly, and there it was, something unspoken, lingering in the air between us. But then he looked away, his expression calm, almost indifferent, and I couldn't tell if I was relieved or hurt. I poured myself a cup of coffee, my hands trembling as I tried to steady my breathing. The silence between us was deafening, filled with the weight of what had happened. I wanted to say something, to confront him, to demand an explanation. But what could I say? What explanation could there possibly be for something like this? So I said nothing. As the days passed, the tension between us only grew. James continued to act as though everything was normal, but his presence was unbearable. Every time he walked into a room, I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. I couldn't look at him without replaying that night in my head, the memory like a scar that refused to heal. I started avoiding him, finding excuses to leave the house or stay in my room when I knew he was around. But no matter how much distance I tried to put between us, I couldn't escape the guilt that followed me everywhere. It was in the quiet moments, the spaces where my thoughts had nowhere else to go, that it consumed me the most. And then there was my daughter. At first, I convinced myself that nothing had changed, that she didn't know, couldn't know. But then I started noticing things. The way she watched me, her eyes narrowing slightly as if trying to read something in my face. The way her tone shifted, subtle but enough to make me wonder if she suspected something. Was it my imagination? Or had I already started to unravel in front of her? One evening, as we sat together in the living room, she turned to me suddenly, her expression unreadable. "Mom," she said, her voice careful, deliberate. "Is everything okay?" The question caught me off guard, and for a moment, I couldn't breathe. "Of course," I said, forcing a smile. "Why wouldn't it be?" She hesitated, her eyes searching mine. "I don't know. You just seem different lately. Distracted." I felt my throat tighten, panic rising in my chest. "It's nothing," I said quickly, waving her concern away. "Just work and the usual stuff. Nothing to worry about." She didn't look convinced, but she didn't press further. Still, her words stayed with me, echoing in my mind long after she'd gone to bed. I was different. I could feel it in every part of me. And no matter how much I tried to hide it, I couldn't shake the fear that she could see right through me. The paranoia started to seep into everything. Every glance, every comment, every moment of silence felt loaded with suspicion. I found myself analyzing everything James said or did, looking for signs that he might slip up, that he might give something away. But he didn't. He was careful, controlled, as if he'd rehearsed his every move. One afternoon, I caught him watching me from across the room. It was just a fleeting moment, a glance that lasted a second too long. But it was enough to send my heart racing, enough to make me feel like the walls were closing in. I left the room, my hands shaking, and locked myself in the bathroom, trying to calm the storm inside me. As I stood there, staring at my reflection in the mirror, I barely recognized the woman looking back at me. Her eyes were tired, haunted, and there was a weight in her expression that hadn't been there before. I wanted to scream, to cry, to do anything to release the guilt and fear that were suffocating me. But instead, I just stood there, silent and still, as the realization washed over me. I had done this to myself. The guilt wasn't just eating away at me, it was changing me. I became hyper-aware of everything, constantly second-guessing myself, my actions, my words. I avoided my husband more than ever, terrified that he might somehow sense what had happened. Every time he reached for my hand or kissed my cheek, I felt like a fraud, a stranger in my own skin. And yet, despite all of it, the guilt, the paranoia, the shame, I couldn't stop thinking about James. He was in my head, in my dreams, in the quiet moments when I was alone. It wasn't just the memory of what we'd done, it was the way he made me feel, the way he saw me in a way no one else did. And that realization terrified me more than anything else. The fallout wasn't just about what had happened, it was about what was happening to me, what I was becoming. I was caught in a web of my own making, and every move I made only seemed to tangle me further. The boundaries I had crossed weren't just between me and James, they were within myself. And the worst part? I didn't know how to find my way back. Nights became the hardest. The darkness had a way of magnifying everything: the guilt, the fear, the longing. I would lie in bed, staring at the ceiling, my husband asleep beside me, his steady breathing a stark contrast to the chaos in my mind. It was in those quiet hours that the weight of what I'd done felt unbearable. I replayed it all, over and over again, as if dissecting it might somehow offer clarity. Where had it started? Was it the first time James lingered too long in a conversation? The first time I let myself feel flattered by his attention? Or was it long before that, in the cracks of my marriage, in the spaces where love and connection had once lived but no longer did? I asked myself the questions that had no easy answers. Was it my fault? Had I invited this into my life, into my home? Or was I simply a victim of my own loneliness, my own need to feel seen? The truth was, I didn't know. And not knowing felt worse than anything else. Loneliness is a strange thing. It doesn't always come from being alone. It can creep in when you're surrounded by people, when you're living a life that looks full but feels empty. That was my life. A marriage that had become more habit than love. A home that felt more like a stage set for a play I was no longer interested in performing. And then James came along, and suddenly, I wasn't invisible anymore. I hated myself for it. For letting my need for validation, for connection, push me to cross a line I should never have crossed. I thought about my daughter, about how much she trusted me, how much she loved him. The betrayal wasn't just in what I'd done, it was in every secret I now carried, every smile I gave her that was laced with guilt. And then there was my husband. He didn't know, of course, but even his ignorance felt like a kind of betrayal. I wanted to tell him, to confess everything and beg for forgiveness. But what would that accomplish? It wouldn't undo what had happened. It wouldn't fix the broken pieces of our marriage. And it wouldn't make the guilt go away. The guilt wasn't just about the act itself. It was about what it revealed about me. I wasn't the person I thought I was, the person I wanted to be. I was someone who had let her own pain and longing drive her to hurt the people she loved the most. And that realization was almost too much to bear. I thought about leaving, about packing a bag and disappearing, sparing my family from the mess I'd made. But where would I go? And what would that solve? Running away wouldn't erase what I'd done, it would only make me a coward. So I stayed, caught in the web of my own making, trying to find a way to live with myself. James was a constant presence in my mind, even when I wasn't around him. I hated how much space he took up in my thoughts, how much I wanted to understand what he was thinking, what he felt. Did he regret it? Did he feel guilty, or was he able to move on as if nothing had happened? The not knowing gnawed at me, a wound that wouldn't close. And yet, there was another question that haunted me even more. Did I regret it? In the moments when I was honest with myself, when I stripped away the layers of guilt and shame, the answer wasn't as simple as I wanted it to be. Part of me did regret it, regretted the pain it would cause, the trust it had shattered. But another part of me didn't. Because in that moment with James, I had felt something I hadn't felt in years. Alive, seen, wanted. That realization was the hardest to accept. Because it meant that no matter how much I hated myself for what I'd done, part of me didn't want to undo it. And what did that say about me? About the kind of person I had become? I started to question everything: my marriage, my role as a mother, even my own identity. Who was I really? Was I the devoted wife and mother I had tried so hard to be, or was I something else entirely? Something darker, more selfish, more flawed? The questions kept me up at night, stealing what little peace I had left. The worst part was knowing that I had no one to blame but myself. James hadn't forced me into anything. He hadn't manipulated me or tricked me. He had offered me something I didn't even realize I was desperate for, and I had taken it, knowing full well the cost. And now I was left to live with the consequences, to carry the weight of my actions and the damage they had caused. I wanted to find a way forward, a way to make things right. But the truth was, I didn't know if that was possible. Some things, once broken, can't be fixed. And I was starting to wonder if I was one of them. As the days turned into weeks, the introspection became a constant, an endless loop of guilt, regret, and longing. I felt like a stranger in my own life, disconnected from the people I loved, from myself. And yet, I couldn't escape the truth. I had made this choice. I had crossed this line. And no matter how much I wished I could, there was no going back. You've heard my story, the choices I made, the mistakes I can't take back. And now, I need to ask you something. What would you do if you were in my shoes? How do you move forward when the weight of your actions feels too heavy to carry? Have you ever felt this kind of loneliness? This kind of desperation to feel seen, even if it meant making choices you never thought you would? If you have, please share your thoughts in the comments. I need to know I'm not alone. Maybe you've been on the other side of this, a daughter who's lost trust in her mother, a spouse who's been betrayed, or even someone who's crossed a line they can't uncross. How did you handle it? What did you learn? I'm not here to make excuses for what I've done. I know it was wrong. But I also know that life is messy, and sometimes we make choices we can't explain, even to ourselves. I'm sharing this story because I want to start a conversation, not just about what I did, but about why. If this story has resonated with you, or if you have thoughts or advice to share, please leave a comment. And if you've ever felt like your story was too complicated or too painful to share, know that this is a safe space. Let's talk about it together. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you want to hear more stories like this, stories that dive into the messy, complicated parts of being human. Because we've all made mistakes and we've all had to find a way to keep going. As I sit here now, reflecting on everything that's happened, there's one thing I know for sure: loneliness is dangerous. It creeps into the cracks of your life, filling the empty spaces with shadows. It makes you question your worth, your choices, even your identity. Loneliness whispers lies to you, lies that make you believe you're invisible, that no one cares, that you'll never feel whole again. And if you're not careful, those lies can lead you down a path you never wanted to take. But here's what I've learned: loneliness doesn't have to define you. It doesn't have to dictate your choices. If you're feeling lost, if you're drifting in that emptiness, don't let it pull you under. Reach out to someone, a friend, a partner, even a stranger, and let them remind you that you're not alone. And to anyone who's struggling in their relationships, let this be a reminder of how important it is to nurture the connections that matter most. Don't let silence replace the words you need to say. Don't let routine take the place of love. And above all, don't let the people you care about slip away without a fight. Because in the end, boundaries matter. They're not just lines we draw to protect ourselves, they're lines that protect the people we love. And once those lines are crossed, it's almost impossible to go back. So please, take this story as a cautionary tale. Don't let loneliness push you to a place where you lose sight of what's right. Don't let it make you forget who you are and who you want to be. And most importantly, don't let it make you believe that you're not worthy of love, connection, and forgiveness. Thank you for listening to my story. It's not an easy one to tell, but I hope it's one that makes you think. And if you've found something in my words that resonates with you, I hope it's this: we all make mistakes, but it's how we face them and how we learn from them that defines who we truly are.